Okay, so in the same way, I'll try to tell you about things that probably don't hear much very often, but it's sort of related to the previous talk by Enrico. I'll try to mention some of the correlations, but it's different in a fundamental way. So the title is already a bit surprising, maybe. Solid state neuroscience. There are things that normally we don't go together. I work at a solid state physics lab. I'm a theorist. I've been doing condensed matter physics all my life. So the first question is, why do neuroscience in a solid state physics lab? And for that, let me make an analogy. In solid state physics, we're interested in materials, like iron. And we're interested in that because it has a functionality, magnetism in this case. And we can go on to make this functionality quantitative by performing experiments. And we discover states of matter, like ferromagnetic state, and we can characterize that. And then we start building models. Like an easy model in mean field already tells us a lot about that. And when we see that we can match what is going on in nature, we get the feeling that we know what we're talking about, and we know what is the mechanism behind this functionality. Similarly, for neuroscience, we have a material, like gray matter. We have functionality. We experience that all the time. And we can measure that and try to make it more quantitative. This is some traditional EEG, but there are more modern techniques of many sorts. So now we are confronted with the need to model this. And only when we have some success modeling this, we'll get a feeling of what's going on in the brain. And to my impression is that this is one of the last significant frontiers of current knowledge where we basically almost know nothing. So it's a challenge and it's fascinating at the same time. So let me go on with the analogy and go back to iron. And when we want to understand the functionality of iron, we may start thinking, okay, what are the degrees of freedom, what are the interactions, what is the topology of the network? Iron has 56 electrons and so many neutrons and protons, and then we may wonder if all of them are important, and we have to keep the full complexity of the atom. Or we can just forget about everything, keep the last electron in the outer shell, and from it only keep its magnetic moment. And the same wise for the lattice. Is it important that it's a BCC lattice or an FCC lattice, or it's not important at all, as in field theory? So for magnetism, ferromagnetism, we have a notion of what's going on. But if what we want to describe is what's going on in the brain, then the units are neurons. Neurons are cells, are electric cells, are cells like all the cells of our body. They have a body and a nucleus, but they have a peculiarity that they are electrically active. And then they're not Ising spins, they're not up and down, they emit what is called the action potentials. So this is an electric signal that evolves in time with a characteristic time scale of a millisecond. Regarding the connectivity of the network, we really don't know much, but there are now exciting experiments in what is been known as connectome, in which we're starting to map how the neurons are interconnected. And of course, that depends strongly on the different regions of the brain, and there are zillions of different neurons and so on. But we're keeping the discussion simple. The point to make here is that neurons are not Ising spins, although most, if not all, of the latest amazing developments in artificial intelligence, and we heard quite a bit in the previous session, are based on representing neurons as pretty much Ising spins, which can be active or inactive. And then we put that in particular geometries like these multi-layers and so on and so forth. But here I want to keep thinking of neurons as systems that emit spikes. Okay, so if we want to understand what neural networks do, we can do two things, at least two things. One is to make a mathematical model, and this will be like a software I could call. So we have a set of differential equations that are in general based on the work of Hatkin and Hodgkin, which were the first to write down an equation for the action potential, and they received the Nobel Prize for that, and try to get from those differential equations the different type of dynamical behavior that one observes experimentally in neurons. And then try to put this kind of equation that describes each one of the neurons into a given topology, interconnect them, and then one is having a big system of differential equations with a multiplicity of parameters. So if you want to model the action potential actuation of a biological neuron, you may need up to 200 channels, ionic channels, that describe the connectivities of the membrane of the cell. On the other hand, we already heard about neuromorphic chips. So neuromorphic chips are nothing but conventional computers which are optimized to run those mathematical models. So they try to keep, as many cores as possible and keep the memory as close to the cores as possible, like the computing units are the neurons and the memory are the synaptic connection between the neurons. So this is neuromorphic, what is called a neuromorphic chip. So the amazing developments in this field is driven by the advances in artificial intelligence and the possible applications, but if one really wants to understand how neural systems, brains, code with spikes, then one would like to model these kind of systems, but there's a problem, because the spikes are delta functions, and these delta functions you want to simulate the system for a longer time to see what it is doing, and then you start worrying about mathematical artifacts coming from the mathematical process of delta functions and the nonlinearities and the recursive, and whether there is chaos or not, and how resilient is that to noise, etc., etc. So is there an alternative route? So one possibility would be to make neurons directly in hardware. That is, to find materials with new functionalities that behave directly as neurons, that emit spikes. And instead of having a transistor, we have now a neuron like a transistor, and we can imagine building new networks directly out of these components. So this is what I'm going to tell you about. So these are called neuromorphic materials. They are based on a relatively new functionality of materials, which is resistive switching and memory stores. Those are the buzzwords. And basically, it consists in applying electric fields, strong electric fields to material, and see that they change the resistance. Sometimes they change the resistance semi-permanently. So you change the resistance and then it remains there, but you cannot undo that. And sometimes it's called volatile. You apply a field, you change the resistance, but then when you take it out, it relaxes back to the original state. The interesting thing is that the non-volatile effect, which has been known and investigated for the past 20 years, has been recognized as a means to encode artificial synapses. That is the connection between the neurons where you're supposed to keep your memories. If you learn to play tennis when you were an infant, then you sort of build synapses that remain there, and you can just put down your racket for 10 years, go back, and pretty much you were before. So these are non-volatile. But neurons, you're now paying attention to what I'm saying, your neurons are activated, and then a few minutes, or maybe even I stop, you just will drift to something else, so your neurons start to do something else, you're in a volatile state. So the surprise, I've been working on mod insulators for maybe the full of my career, and the surprise was to see that these mod insulators can have a new functionality which allows to recreate these spike-emitting neurons. So what are mod materials? Mod materials are materials that, from all we know in condensed matter physics, we have a density functional theory that started from the position of atoms to predict what will be the bond structure, what they will be. If they have a gap, they were insulators. If they don't have a gap, they will be metals. And these materials, they should be metals. But then you go to the lab, and they're insulators. So this is one particular example I've been involved. And this is a perfectly pure crystal. And you see that at room temperature, this material, if you follow the orange line here, there is a very low pressure applied to that, room pressure or light pressure, and you see that the resistivity, as you lower the temperature, goes up and up and up and up and up. That is the classic behavior of an insulator. But then you apply a moderate amount of pressure, 3 gigapascals, and you see that something happens, and then you apply 5 gigapascal, and you see that the resistivity goes crashing down, while at high temperature, room temperature, you wouldn't be able to predict how different this will be. So, in essence, this is a mod material because it is an insulator, but should be a metal. So it's a particular case of insulator which is sort of fragile. By doing pressure, and pressure is not a big perturbation in the solid state, you can crash down the resistivity orders of magnitude. So, I don't know, besides astrophysics, things which require 10 orders of magnitude to be described. So this is quite a phenomenal effect. And one thing that was predicted by theory, actually during my PhD, was that this transition should be first order. And here there is validation of this first order aspect by this hysteresis loop. So I started interacting with a group that was taking these beautiful crystals and applying electric pulses and see what was going on with that. Try to break down that mod state, break down the resistance. So this is a very challenging problem because dealing with mod insulators is a challenge, and putting them totally out of equilibrium with a strong electric pulse is even a bigger one. We've done numerical simulations with my postdoc, Pablo Stoller, who is now permanent in Japan, and we saw resistor networks that indicated that it's not a true phase transition that is going on, but a spatial-temporal instability in the form of a filamentary formation where the filaments are metallic state. So this was validated by experiments where you see here, you apply a voltage, and this is the resistance, and the resistance after some microseconds, hundreds of microseconds, collapses. But then when the applied voltage goes down to 0, the resistance recovers to the original. So this is the volatile phenomenon that I was describing before. But you may think that, okay, you need a resistor network just to describe this filamentary formation, but I can imagine in 5 minutes lots of ways to capture this kind of resistive breakdown. So how about a non-trivial validation? So we imagine what kind of simulation could put the finger into a non-trivial validation, and we, from theory of this first-order transitions in mod materials, we said, well, if it's a first-order transition, then it should be metastability. So the system is stable in its mod insulating state, but there should be something which is called a correlated metal, some metallic state associated to that somewhere in some phase diagram, which is metastable, because the system relaxes back to the mod insulating state. If there is a metastability barrier, then there is a time scale associated to that. So I said, how about trying to put that in evidence? So our simulations, of course, predicted that depending on the time between short pulses, and by short I mean it's too short to create the resistive collapse. So we are applying short pulses without resistive collapse, and then if we apply the pulses within a time scale which is faster than the relaxation associated to this barrier, then there will be a cumulative effect. And the simulations predicted that this cumulative effect, after a few pulses, will crush down the resistance, and there will be no more voltage on the material. Then Pablo, who is an experimentalist, went to the lab and tried that, and he got beautiful agreement even in the behavior of this tau, etc. So the crucial thing was that we apply pulses, but then at some point the resistive collapse makes that the next pulse will generate a spike of current going through the system. So that led us to the first aha moment. And the first aha moment is that this behavior is what neurons do. So neurons have input pulses going through what are called the dendrites. So you input current pulses this way, and then there's a cumulative effect. If these pulses are strong enough and frequent enough, this will bring the neuron to a threshold, and beyond that threshold, it will emit what is called the action potential that I was describing before. That action potential through the synaptic connections, that is the JIJs, that is the couplings, transmit that information to the next neuron. So the simplest model that captures this kind of spiky behavior goes back more than 100 years, which I find fascinating by this couple of French researchers. So you see here a neuron adding the pulses that are coming through its dendrites. So you see here the red, the blue, the green, and then the first one to arrive is the red. This is integrated by the body of the cell. So the voltage on the cell goes up by integrating the delta, then it starts relaxing, another pulse comes through another dendrite, it gets integrated and relaxed, and another one comes. So when these are coming fast enough and strong enough, they get the voltage on the neuron above this threshold, and then it emits an output spike there and here. So this is called the leaky integrate amplifier model, because the neurons integrate the income delta functions, and then they leak. The voltage leaks out through conductances, and when it goes through the threshold, it fires. So with my collaborators in NALT, that they were doing the experiments, we put this into a solid ground, comparing the behavior, systematically comparing the behavior of this mod material under pulsing with the model of a leaky integrated amplifier. And being a theorist, I was quite happy to have even a patent out of this. So this took another spin when I started collaborating with Ivan Schuler from UCSD, who has a group that makes probably the best mod materials in thin films, which you need in order to have electronic applications. So here you have one of those materials. It's VO2, vanadium oxide. So this is a film of vanadium oxide with two electrodes that recreate a very simple two-electrode material. So you apply the pulses between these two electrodes, and you see the resistance of this collapse. And we did a theory for that and explained some non-trivial experiments that went into this series of papers, and this was with the help of one of the co-organizers, Lorenzo Fratino, who will be talking in the next. And this has been very, very productive, so we got renewed, just got a week ago the information that this was renewed for 4 more years, so that's very good news. But you may be thinking in your mind, but how about conventional electronics? With conventional electronics, we can do anything. Why can't we do these simple neurons, integrated fire neurons, with conventional electronics? And the answer is, of course, you can do everything with conventional electronics. This is an example of that. And the only inconvenience is that this basic model of a neuron has so many transistors that it's very hard to understand. It's very hard to understand, very hard to design. You can do that in VLSI, and people do it to make millions of neurons, and you can do that. It takes years to develop, and the moment it is done, it is done. You cannot, you give up all the possibility to tinker with that, to change things, to change the topology, and so on. So, can we get the best of both worlds? Namely, the simplicity of mod memory stores and the reliability of conventional silicon electronics. And the answer is yes. This was the second aha moment. So here, again, you have a neuron with its dendrites that are receiving input, and then when it goes over the threshold, it emits a spike. So essentially what's going on is that you input a current. This current gets integrated in a capacitor, and you have here what is called a memory store, but it's just a switch that when the voltage and the charge in the capacitor, or its voltage, gets to a threshold, the resistance of this device just crashes down, and then this capacitor discharges quickly through this collapsed memory store, and then you have a spike of current going through it. So this is just a leaky integrated fire. The second aha moment was to remember things that I learned in high school, which is a technician in electronics, and I remember that there were conventional components of electronics that fire. So I went with Google into look up what are the components there, and this is one of the oldest components of electronics. I'm sure all of you know what a diode is, the P and N material that conducts one way and not in the other. And then after the PN, they invented the PNP, which is the bijunction transistor. And then, of course, the next step is to do PN. Now you apply a voltage, and you have 2 diodes in direct, but you have one interface, which is in inverse. So this thing does not conduct. But if you go beyond the threshold, it suddenly conducts. And the key insight was to realize that this behavior of the thyristor, this is the name of this conventional electronic component, has the same qualitative behavior as the mod IV characteristic. So then I said, okay, with this, we should be able to fabricate a neuron in no time, and we did. This was 3 years ago, and since then, we've been working on this very intensively. So this system realized the leaky integrated fire because it integrates with the capacitor, as all conventional electronic systems do. Then it leaks through a resistance, and it fires through this thyristor that can collapse its resistance. Crucial to that is the hysteresis phenomenon, and then to demonstrate that this circuit with the memory store is the same as what we were having with mod materials. You see that this is the IV characteristic of both, and this is the spike generation of both. And the problem with mod materials is that mod materials are very hard to fabricate. Very few people in the world have the know-how to make this systematically and not even. You need to develop lithography, you need to develop sputtering, PLD, etc. While thyristors, you just order them online and you get it the next day, and they cost cents. So they only, literally, cents. So you can fabricate neurons for pennies. And And the only problem is that your students have to keep track if a transistor gets burned to throw it away immediately and not start mixing it up. So these are extremely convenient, extremely cheap, readily available, and they make up beautiful neurons that work always. So we made progress in demonstrating that we can very simply interconnect these neurons to make functional networks. So this is one example, which is a classic model from neuroscience, where it is for sound detection to detect the directionality of the voice. So this allowed us to show that we can interconnect many of these neurons and obtain the functionality. Another one is that we have one neuron and with a self-connection, this is called an out-ups, and we've been able to make contact with experiments in neuroscience. So I'll be happy to give you details about that, but since I have very limited time, I would like to show you what is getting me very interested. Now, this is recent work with my student, Jimian Wu. So, in models of neurons, you know that if you add a second time constant, you can get from simple spiking to bursting behavior. And bursting neurons are important for many things, including many diseases like epilepsy and Parkinson's disease. So we said, okay, we have our trivial neural model with a capacitor and a membrane store. So how about adding another time constant? And adding a time constant is just an RC. RC is an RC circuit brings in a tau time constant, which is the product of the resistance times the capacitance. And we did that. We measure the behaviors of this system, and we obtain different type of bursting behavior. If you want to model this kind of system, this is a famous model, Physique, and you have this amount of differential equations with a multiplicity of parameters that you have to use in order to build networks. So it's networks of this, you have this set of differential equations for each neuron that you want to simulate. So with this, we can immediately start drawing circuits and looking for functionalities. So this is one example, even without going into circuits, of how our model neuron behaves compared to some traces of real biological neurons that I found in the literature, where you apply neurotoxins and then you observe how the spiking form changes, and we obtain very nice qualitative behavior on the same time scales, which we control totally in this circuit. But then, coming from physics, very different from neuroscience, we said, okay, let's look at the phase diagram. And this is the input current, and this is the time constant that we added to our neuron, and we find out that we can characterize all the different regions in the phase space. We said, okay, can we go beyond that? And then we can compare to some of these experiments, and we see that some experiments show that you take one of these pacemaker neurons, that are neurons that are supposed to be associated to automatic behaviors, and they make the neuron silent by some neurotoxin, and then they start increasing the applied current to excite that neuron. They observe that there are bursts, and the bursts become more often at a higher frequency, and eventually they go into fast spiking, which is very, very quickly spiked. And then it's very interesting, even exciting, to see that that is totally compatible with some of the behavior that we are finding in our circuit. In this axis, vertically, we are only applying current. We start from a state where the neuron is quiet, and then we go through this first bursting region, which is this one, which ends in the fast spiking. So we may start thinking on speculating that this may just bring another light to understand what is the systematic behavior that neurons do in order when they go from one normal behavior to some abnormal behavior, which is at the origin of some diseases like epilepsy, Parkinson, etc. So this is bringing a new way to look at these problems in a systematic fashion. So then I will finish this with some personal note. So a year ago, I fell victim of this theoretical physics midlife crisis, and of course I didn't buy the red convertible.
What do you mean, of course?
I was going to say, at least not yet. And I bought myself a lab. I started a new life as an experimentalist. So this is the lab. It's a simple electronic lab. There are students there already doing the experiments that I showed you a moment ago. And I would like to leave you with something that immediately, just like I got total identification with it. This is the blackboard of Richard Feynman. When he died, they took a picture of the blackboard. And you see that right up there, he wrote to remind himself that what I cannot create, I do not understand. And this is exactly what was motivating me, it's motivating me in following this experimental plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is there time for questions? So, yeah.
Thank you for the talk. How important is this membristic behavior? You showed us memristor there, and I just wanted to understand how important is it for your working of the mechanism, this membristor behavior, memory behavior, maybe.
Okay, so the membristor is a device that allows, because of its nonlinearity, allows to fabricate, implement very simple spiking neurons. And then we start combining them.
Is it
now
something that you are using as memory thing?
No.
Okay.
No. I'm starting now with circuits that we know the topology, how the interactions are. We are now starting with some preliminary results in going into the memory part. For instance, STDP is how the mechanism by which spiking neurons encode their memories. But the memories, you can imagine that you start with a fully connected lattice, which does nothing because it's fully connected. It's like mean field, of course. But then by tailoring, pruning the connections, you can get some function out of that. So that is the vision. Try to learn how these systems organize to acquire different functionalities. So
Thanks.
that's okay.
So fascinating talk, but this is a cheeky question, so forgive me. But one way of understanding what you're doing is a silicon emulation of neural systems. But another question would be, if you're looking for the functionality, why not work directly with the neural systems? Instead of going into your laboratory in silico, why don't you go into brain cells?
Okay, people do, but it's extremely hard because you have to, and it's messy. It's not only chemistry, it's biology. So people do that every day. They do fascinating things. There are now novel techniques which totally blow your mind away, which is optogenetics, for instance. So you can observe the neurons. You have an animal that could be Drosophila, it's a fruit fly, and you genetically modify the neurons to emit light when they are active. So you put that under a microscope, and you know which neurons are firing when you present some virtual reality to the fly. And even more impressive than that is that you can then come with optical fiber and a laser and excite neurons one by the same optogenetic mechanism. So one of the projects we're working on is to try to interact with a living animal. In this case, is a zebrafish larva which is transparent, so it's convenient to look through it, and interconnect the fish with our neurons and try to endow the animal with capabilities that are not natural, or, you know, starts really sounding horrible. But
Maybe two more questions.
I came to Caltech as a postdoc in 1988, and the Blackboard was not yet erased. And also on it was talked about quantum computing, which he was interested in. But the other thing was that he had a part of how can I not get physics today? So he wanted to be a member of the American Physical Society, but not receive Physics Today every month, because no matter how much he said, don't send it to me, they kept sending it to me. They're probably still sending it to his grave.
The last question was Ben, I think. Yeah.
I would like to follow up on a previous question, namely why neuromorphic computing? I understand that it can be faster and more efficient, but I'm wondering, is there evidence that it can do more than that? There are things that artificial neural networks now are not good at, but biological neural networks are. For example, few-shot learning. We train artificial neural networks with thousands of examples, but you need to show an elephant to a child only once or twice and it knows what that is. I'm wondering, is there any evidence that working with spikes actually provides an advantage? Whereas, you know, artificial neural networks as we do them nowadays don't work with spikes. So is there any evidence, any theory at least, for why the spikes would matter?
Yeah. So that's an extremely good question, for which I don't have an answer, but that's not my motivation. I don't follow this route to do computations. I want just to try to understand the neural code, how functionalities are achieved by combining neurons and what they have to do. And if they are more efficient or not than digital computers, or by representing neurons with 1 and zeros, I don't know. I don't think that there is a theorem for that. But we are, as much as we believe, we are, and all animals that have these electric circuits are living proof that this is a way to do things. And we want to understand why, because at the end of the day, we are here just thinking with our brains, and we want to understand how can matter thinks of itself. So that is the big mystery behind. So I just would like to, you know, in a very constructive, microscopic manner, this is like, you know, starting from atomic physics to derive Stokes equations. Perhaps we'll never get there, but perhaps we'll learn interesting things down the line.
So let's thank you again.